Vengeful Visage, a mage secret, which costs 3 mana, of course. After an enemy minion attacks your hero, summon a copy of it to attack the enemy hero. So this is kind of a weird card. Like, it kind of seems like an aggro card because it's going face, but it kind of seems like a value card because it gives you a minion. Getting a minion is also good for aggro, but as the aggro deck, it's kind of weird that the opponent would be attacking you in the face for this effect to actually go off. So it ends up feeling a bit awkward. It's kind of hard to imagine a deck that would really want to play this card, hard to imagine it being good in that deck. But it is the case that if you're playing like a burn mage with fireballs or whatever, part of the game plan for a control opponent would be to like stabilize their health total a little bit, and then they need to finish you off before you can draw into your fireballs and frost bolts or whatever. So like in that kind of deck, in that kind of meta, maybe you could play this, and then if they hit you in the face with their freaking, I don't even know, like a Galvangar or something, then they would also take the damage, and it's like kind of hard for them to close out the game against you. But it seems pretty easy to play around with like just some token. A lot of decks have Colossals that are pretty good at playing around this sort of effect. Seems pretty sketchy. But we do have Arcanologist, we do have Explosive Runes, so if they print more support for an aggressive Secret Mage deck, I think this card does make some amount of sense. Next up we have Druid's Location card, Hedge Maze. 3 mana with 2 durability, and you can trigger a friendly minion's death rattle. Well, at the moment, Druid has like no good death rattles to use with this. There's like Humongous Owl, maybe a Moarg Forge Fiend or something. I think there's like maybe one other good big death rattle. But at the moment, this card is pretty much unplayable in Druid. So we're just going to have to wait and see what big death rattles they get. But if they get like Hadronox or something that's big and can flood the board or can deal a bunch of damage or something, then this card can definitely be good. This card definitely has a high enough power level to see play in like a tier 1 deck, but it remains to be seen if that deck exists. Next we have the Priest Location card, 3 mana 3 durability. It gives the minion +2/+1 and it draws a card. So 3 mana, 6/3, draw 3 cards. Pretty powerful, certainly pretty powerful. But it is a location card, and I didn't realize this when they first showed locations, but there is actually a cooldown between the uses of this card. So if you use the effect on turn 3, you cannot use it on the following turn, so then you could use it again on turn 5, and you wouldn't be able to use it on 6, but then you could use it on 7. So it takes a long time to get the value out of this card. And I think if you wanted to be drawing cards in Priest, like you have Switcheroo, you have Handmaiden, maybe depending on the kind of Priest deck, those effects are just better. Also, the buff and the draw of this are tied together. So like if you don't have a board and your opponent does, like you can buff your opponent's minion to draw a card, but you obviously don't really want to be giving your opponent's minions free stats. So it might actually be kind of awkward to get the card draw sometimes. So I think even though the value of this card seems really high for its mana cost, it is pretty slow, pretty awkward to use. I don't think it's necessarily just going to slot into every Priest deck, but it is still pretty strong. Unlike most buff cards, you don't actually have to have a minion in play the turn you play this. You can just play this on 3 and then turn 4, play a minion and immediately buff it, which is pretty nice. Seems like it might be pretty good in Naga Priest, because a 2/1 buff is really good on things that are low attack, high health, like Treasure Guard or Vicious Slither Spear. Just things that they kind of already play, and just any more stats you can get in that deck is pretty good. Even for a control deck, you can slap some extra stats on a Taunt minion, or you can buff a Blade Master Samuro, or you can buff a Wild Pyromancer so it gets 1 extra activation. So yeah, I think the card has a lot of potential. It just depends if you're willing to play something this slow, and I think a lot of Priest decks will be willing to. I think there's enough value in this card that it can definitely see play. Next up, we're moving to the Volatile Skeleton package with the Volatile Skeleton itself, which is a neutral 2 mana 2/2 with Death Rattle, deal 2 damage to a random enemy. So even without the synergies, I think this card on its own is just like pretty reasonable. It has kind of poor stats, but 50% of the time it's going to trade with a 2/3 anyway. And unlike a lot of 2 mana cards, this also has the potential to trade with a 3 mana 3/4, which is pretty nice. Also, if you're an aggressive deck playing this against a control deck, You play your 2-drop, they remove it with a 2-mana spell. It's kind of nice that you get 2 damage on the enemy hero, even though you're like going even on cards and mana. I think there's a possibility that this card on its own could just see play in something like Face Hunter that really just cares about going face. But I think the problem with this just being a generically good card is that so many decks nowadays are synergy based. A lot of aggro decks are like Burlock or Mech or Naga or whatever. And I think in those decks you kind of want to hit like a critical mass of those certain minion types, and you're not really just going to want to play a basically 2-mana Leper Gnome in your deck. But there certainly have been some decks in the past that would like a 2-mana Leper Gnome with maybe a little bit of trading potential. But where the Volatile Skeleton is really going to shine is with the new Mage Legendary, Kel'Thuzad the Inevitable. 8 mana 6/8, with Battlecry, resurrect your Volatile Skeletons. Any that can't fit on the battlefield instantly explode. So there are like 3 or 4 mage cards that make these skeletons. There's the neutral skeleton itself that we just saw. So Kel'Thuzad can resurrect potentially a lot of skeletons. It wouldn't be unreasonable to make like 10 skeletons in a game, or possibly even more. So if you do have 10 skeletons dead, Kel'Thuzad's going to take up a board space. You can summon 6 skeletons, and then the last 4 instantly explode, so they'll deal 2 damage to random enemies. I think this is like a pretty good finisher card in a skeleton mage deck. If you're worried about the board, this is going to shoot a bunch of shots at the board. If you're worried about killing your opponent, it's probably going to shoot a bunch of shots at their face. Seems pretty reasonable. It does, of course, depend how powerful all the other skeleton cards are, but I'm going to give you the coldest take of all time. I don't think they would print this many skeleton cards and them not be at least somewhat playable. And if they're all completely unplayable, then something's just going to get buffed so that they are playable. So Kel'Thuzad's probably going to be a pretty reasonable card. The biggest issue with it is like, is it better than Mech Mage? Is it better than Big Spell Mage? Kind of remains to be seen, but I definitely think it has potential. Next up for Mage, we have Deathborne. 6 mana frost spell that deals 2 damage to all minions, and then you summon a 2/2 Volatile Skeleton for each killed. And notably, this is a 2-sided board clear, so if you have some skeletons in play, you can kill those and make more skeletons, which immediately triggers the death rattles for however many you killed, and it pumps more skeletons into your Kel'Thuzad. So killing your own board with this card is actually pretty good, but you can also kill your opponent's stuff as well. You are going to have to kill things with only 2 damage, which might be a little bit difficult, but the skeletons you already have in play, they can like trade off and set up some math for you to make it work a little bit better. And one thing that Mage can do is they can blizzard your opponent's board, freeze it, weaken it up a little bit, and then play a Deathborne to kill the opponent's board. I think if Skeleton Mage is a thing, this is going to be a really important part of it, because this is the card that's going to allow you to have plenty of excess skeletons, so that your Kel'Thuzad does something immediately and doesn't just make a board. So I think this is going to be one of its most key cards, even among the skeleton package. Mage's location card is Nightcloak Sanctum. 3 mana, 3 durability, freeze a minion, summon a 2/2 skeleton. Again, just more support for Kel'Thuzad. Even on its own, it's 3 mana for 3 2-drops, and you also get to freeze 3 targets. That's pretty good. It does have the cooldown issue, so it like takes a while to get all the value out of this. But you don't need your skeletons until turn 8 or later with Kel'Thuzad, so I think that's kind of fine. And the freeze effect on this does help you like get through those turns, because it's going to slow down the game a bit. So yeah, again, I mean, it just kind of depends on how good the skeletons are, but I think this card is pretty good in the skeleton deck. And I believe this is the final skeleton card, at least for Mage. 4 mana frost spell, summon 2 2/2 Volatile Skeletons, and gain 4 armor. Seems pretty good. You want to make skeletons for Kel'Thuzad. This makes 2 skeletons. It's just like pretty good value on its own. 4 mana, you get 2 2-drops, and then you also get 4 armor on top of that. The 4 armor pairs like kind of nicely with the freeze from the location to help you get into the late game for Kel'Thuzad. It just seems very solid to me if you care about making skeletons. And as I said, with at least 5 cards in the set dedicated to it, I don't think there's a world where this is just straight up terrible. I mean, look at like Murloc Warlock from the last set. They buffed it so it was playable. The curses also for Warlock, they buffed those to make sure they were playable. The skeletons, if they're not good at launch, will probably be good at some point. The archetype kind of reminds me of like Bomb Warrior or even like Curse Warlock, where all the cards, like on their own, they don't really stand out as being super powerful, but the more of them you play, the more they just kind of chip at your opponent. And then there is like the big payoff card with Kel'Thuzad that I think is probably going to be pretty good at ending games. Next up for Mage, we have Frozen Touch, 2-mana Frost spell, with deal 3 damage, infuse 3, add a Frozen Touch to your hand. So infuse 3, that means you need 3 friendly minions to die while this is in your hand, and if you do that, you get to cast 2-mana deal 3 damage, that adds another 2-mana deal 3 damage to your hand. And that Frozen Touch that's added to your hand will not be infused, but you potentially can infuse it. So if you have enough minions, this could be 2-mana deal 3, 2-mana deal 3, 2-mana deal 3, over and over again. I think this card's probably just pretty good. We've seen a lot of Dark Bomb, Frostbolt type cards in the past. They're usually at least playable. This has a lot of potential to be infused with like skeletons or mechs or, you know, whatever else Mage is doing. Potentially pretty good in like an aggressive Secret Mage if that's a thing. And it's also a Frost spell, which can matter for the Mage quest line. It can matter for multicaster. I think this is just a very, very solid card. I'd be surprised if it sees no play. Elitist Snob, moving on to Paladin. 5-mana 3/4 with Battle Cry. For each Paladin card in your hand, randomly gain Divine Shield, Lifesteal, Rush, or Taunt. And as far as I know, you cannot get the same keyword twice. So if you have 4 Paladin cards, you always get all 4 keywords. So basically, this card is Zilliax with 2 extra health and you can play 2 copies of it. So it just seems really, really good. Also, Zilliax is probably at its best in the class with all the hand buff stuff. So it's just hard for me to imagine this card not being really good. You do, of course, have to have Paladin cards in your hand, but I think that's like pretty easy to do. Like Mech Paladin has Radar Detector that's 2-mana draw 5 sometimes. And then the hand buff stuff, they like to keep a big hand so they can hand buff all of it. Things like Bannerman help a lot with this. And even if you do end up missing one of the keywords, it's like still a pretty solid card. So yeah, I mean, I think this card's just insane. I'd be really surprised if there are very many Paladin decks that aren't happy to play this. Next we have the Sinful Sous Chef. 1-mana 2/1, Death Rattle, add 2 Silverhand Recruits to your hand. So that's going to be 2 Paladin cards for the Elitist Snob we just saw. But also on its own, I think this card is just good. It's a 1-mana 2/1 that does something, even if it just gets hero powered. It adds things to your hand that you can hand buff. There's Silverhand Recruit synergy that we're going to see coming up. It's just a very solid 1-drop. It's kind of like a more stable version of Peasant. 1-mana 2/1, you always get something out of it. Card from your deck is probably better than 2 recruits, but that's not even necessarily true. Next, a Paladin legendary, Stewart the Steward. 3-mana 3/3 with Death Rattle, give the next Silverhand Recruit you summon +3/+3 and this Death Rattle. Well, in a Silverhand Recruit deck, this just seems very powerful. Whether you play the ones from your hand from the Sous Chef, or you use your hero power, it's either 1 or 2 mana to make a 4/4 that makes your next recruit a 4/4 that makes your next recruit a 4/4. If you're making a lot of recruits throughout the game, I think this card is just very, very good. It is a little bit weak up front, but it doesn't take much time at all to get that tempo back. I think probably the biggest downside with this card is Lightforged Cariel, which is extremely strong. She will get rid of your recruit hero power, which will make it harder to use Stewart the Steward, so you probably can't play these cards in the same deck. Otherwise, I think it'd probably be pretty good to just play this card in Control Paladin. And I don't know, maybe you just play it in Control Paladin anyway, that wouldn't surprise me. But in any deck that cares about making recruits, I think this card is very powerful. And finally for today, we have the Buffet Biggun. 4-mana 2/4 with Battle Cry, summon 2 Silverhand Recruits. Infuse 3, give them +2 attack and Divine Shield. So if you get the infuse off, this is really, really strong. 4 mana for a 2/4 and 2 3/1s with Divine Shield. And it shouldn't be hard to infuse this card because you're playing it in a Silverhand Recruit deck that's making a bunch of Silverhand Recruits that are going to die that are going to infuse this. So that seems pretty solid. There's also the potential that you play this on the turn after Stewart the Steward, and one of those recruits is also going to have +3/+3. I think if you're playing a Silverhand Recruit deck, you just obviously play this card. But you might also just play this in like Mech Paladin. It's just good stats on its own, even if you don't care about the Silverhand Recruit effect. I don't know, like Mech Paladin kind of cares about playing as many mechs as they can, so I don't know if you could necessarily play this in that deck. But it's high enough stats that it's very possible you do. All three of these Silverhand Recruit cards look really strong. I guess one thing to say about these Silverhand Recruit cards in general, the Buffet Biggun and particularly Stewart the Steward, is that Shimmering Starfish is already a really good card. So it's not even like people would necessarily be playing it to tech against this. They would just be playing it because it's really good. Or the Smothering Starfish, excuse me. But even with that, I am pretty interested in seeing if Dude Paladin can make a bit of a comeback.